The chamber went silent the moment the vote counter turned red, and I knew, right there, that humanity had just lost something it would never get back. My name is Daniel Ashford, and I was standing in the observation ring of the Great Assembly Hall when the Council passed Directive 11, a law that would strip my species of the right to build warships larger than a transport hull. Around me, 11 different alien delegations sat in their tiered seats, some clicking their mandibles in quiet satisfaction, others simply staring forward with the blank patience of beings who had been running this galaxy for longer than my entire civilization had existed. I felt my hands tighten around the railing in front of me. Nobody else in that chamber seemed to think anything unusual had happened. To them, this was just another Tuesday in the endless business of managing younger species. To me, it felt like watching a door close on something my grandparents had fought and bled to build. I had been the human liaison to the Galactic Council for 6 years. 6 years of sitting in rooms like this one, translating not just language but intention, trying to explain to my own government why the Council had denied us another trade route, another colony charter, another simple request that any other species would have received without a second glance. 6 years of hearing the same phrase over and over again, spoken with that particular tone of practiced patience: humanity is not yet ready. Not yet ready. I had heard those words so many times that they had stopped feeling like an insult and started feeling like a wall, permanent and immovable, built around every door my people tried to walk through. I remembered, only a month earlier, sitting across from a junior Karathi administrator who had denied a simple request from a human agricultural cooperative seeking permission to expand irrigation rights on a moon our own colonists had terraformed with our own resources. The administrator had not even bothered to read the full proposal before declining it, citing a generic concern about resource strain that did not apply to a project involving water we had created ourselves out of ice harvested from our own asteroid claims. When I pointed this out, he had simply smiled, the particular polite smile aliens reserved for humans who pointed out inconvenient facts, and told me the decision would be revisited at the Council's convenience. That was 11 months ago. It had never been revisited. I had filed 3 follow-up requests, and each one had vanished into the same patient, bureaucratic silence that swallowed nearly everything humanity asked for. The delegate who spoke next was Magistrate Oduin, an elder of the Threll Compact, a species so old that their homeworld had been rebuilt 3 times after their own son had nearly killed them. Oduin's voice carried through the chamber with the smooth, unhurried confidence of someone who had never once been told no. "The findings of this council are clear," Oduin said, his translator device giving his words a calm, almost gentle quality that made the message underneath feel even colder. "Humanity has shown remarkable growth in a short span of galactic time, but growth without restraint is the seed of disaster. We have seen this before, with the Karathi, with the Vance Collective, with a dozen species who believed themselves ready for power before they understood its weight. We act now not out of cruelty but out of care." I wanted to stand up and ask Magistrate Oduin which disaster, exactly, humanity had caused. We had not invaded anyone. We had not broken a single treaty. We had built farms on dead moons and turned poisoned water into clean rivers on worlds nobody else wanted. We had done everything asked of us, and in return, we were being told that the size of our own ships, built with our own resources, defending our own colonies, was now somebody else's decision to make. But I did not stand up. That was not my role. My role was to watch, to record, and to report back to Earth without causing what the Council liked to call an incident. I had learned, over 6 years, exactly how dangerous that word could be for a human career. Beside me stood Grace Whitfield, the senior attaché from Sol Command, a woman who had spent 20 years in service before being assigned to this post, and who had a way of going very, very still whenever she was angry. She did not move during the vote. She did not blink. But I could see the muscle in her jaw working, slow and steady, like she was grinding the moment down to something she could swallow. "They are doing this because of the colony at Aldrin Reach," she said quietly, once the chamber had begun to empty, and the alien delegates filed out in their long ceremonial robes. "They are doing this because 3 weeks ago we requested a survey permit for the outer belt, and the Threll Compact has mining interests 2 systems over." "You think this is about resources," I said. "I think this is about reminding us who decides what we are allowed to have," Grace said. "It has never been about safety. It has never been about readiness. It is about control, and they have gotten very good at calling control by gentler names." I did not argue with her, because I did not think she was wrong. I had seen the pattern myself, over and over, in 100 small decisions that never seemed important enough on their own to fight. A denied request here, a delayed permit there, a quiet redrawing of a border that always seemed to favor whichever species had a seat closer to the center of the chamber. None of it ever looked like an attack. It always looked like procedure, like paperwork, like the slow, patient machinery of an ancient government, doing what ancient governments do. But machinery has a way of grinding people down without ever raising its voice, and I had started to wonder, somewhere around year 4 of my posting, whether my own people understood just how much weight they were carrying without complaint. That evening, I returned to the Human Residency Tower, a modest structure on the edge of the Council's capital station, far smaller than the embassies of the species who had been members for centuries. From my window I could see the lights of a dozen alien districts stretching out in every direction, glittering and endless, a reminder of just how small a piece of this galaxy actually belonged to us. I opened a private channel to my sister, Lily, who was stationed at Aldrin Reach as a colony engineer. She answered on the second ring, her face tired but smiling, dust from the construction site still smudged across one cheek. "You look like you had a long day," she said. "You have no idea," I told her. "The Council just passed a new restriction. No more large warships for us. Not without their approval, which they will never give." Lily's smile faded a little, but she shrugged it off, the way she shrugged off most things, with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up believing that hard work eventually solved every problem. "We will manage. We always do. Besides, out here we are too busy building things to worry about politics back at the capital. How is the colony?" "Growing," she said, and her eyes brightened again. "We just brought the second water reclamation plant online. 3,000 people now, Daniel. 3,000 people living somewhere that was just frozen rock 5 years ago. Come visit sometime. You spend too much time in that glass tower listening to old men in robes tell you what we cannot do." I laughed, because it was easier than admitting how true that felt. We talked for a while longer, about nothing important, about our parents back on Earth, about a meal she wanted to cook for me whenever I finally found time to visit. It was an ordinary conversation, the kind siblings have 1,000 times without ever realizing how much they will miss it later. Before the channel closed, Lily asked me something that has stayed with me ever since. A small question she tossed out almost carelessly, the way people do when they have no idea how much weight a moment will carry later. "Do you ever wonder," she said, "why they never tell us what they are actually afraid of? Every restriction, every denied request, they always talk about readiness, about care, about protecting us from ourselves. But they never once explain what exactly they think we might do if they let us grow at our own pace. I think that is the point," I told her. "If they explained it, we might start asking why the explanation never quite makes sense." She laughed, but there was something thoughtful underneath it, a flicker of the same restlessness I had been feeling for months without quite naming it. "Maybe one day someone will make them explain it properly." "Maybe," I said, and we left it there, because neither of us could have guessed how soon that day would come, or how much it would cost to arrive at it. After the call ended, I sat by the window for a long time, watching the alien capital glitter below me, and I thought about Magistrate Oduin's voice, calm and patient, explaining why my species could not be trusted with the right to defend itself properly. I did not know it yet, but somewhere beyond the edge of charted space, far past the reach of any council sensor array, something was already moving, something my own government had been building in silence for years, hidden behind 100 layers of misdirection and careful, deliberate patience. The council believed it understood humanity. It believed it had measured us, weighed us, and decided exactly how much rope to give a species it considered young and dangerous. It had no idea how wrong it was. I went to sleep that night still angry about Directive 11, still turning Grace Whitfield's words over in my mind, still thinking about my sister's bright, tired smile through the static of a long-distance call. I had no way of knowing that within a month, that smile would be the last clear memory I had of her, and that the quiet, patient anger building in every human heart across the galaxy was about to find its breaking point. The Council had spent decades deciding what humanity was allowed to become. They were about to find out what humanity had decided for itself. The alarm woke me 4 hours before my morning briefing, and I knew from the pitch of it alone that something had gone badly wrong. It was not the soft chime the residency tower used for routine messages. It was the harsh, layered tone reserved for emergency channels, The kind of sound engineered to cut through sleep and panic and confusion all at once. I was on my feet before I even registered standing up, pulling on my uniform jacket while the message scrolled across my wall display in stark red lettering. Aldrin Reach. Quarantine action in progress. Council enforcement vessel Threll Watcher has engaged. For a moment I could not make sense of the words. Aldrin Reach was a colony, not a target. There was no war, no conflict, nothing that should have warranted a quarantine, let alone an enforcement vessel engaging with anything at all. My first thought was that this had to be some kind of mistake, a misfile, a training simulation that had been broadcast to the wrong channel. Then I saw the timestamp, and I saw that the message had already been live for 11 minutes, and I felt my stomach drop somewhere far below the floor. I called Lily immediately. The channel rang once, twice, 3 times, and then gave me nothing but silence. Not even the automated message that usually played when a line was simply busy. I tried again. Nothing. I tried a 3rd time, my hands shaking now, and on the 4th attempt, the channel connected to a burst of static, so thick, I could not tell if there was a voice underneath it or not. I ran. I do not remember most of the walk from my quarters to the Human Residency's communications center, only fragments, the cold tile under my bare feet, because I had not had time to find shoes. The way the corridor lights seemed too bright, too clean, too calm, for what was happening somewhere across the galaxy. When I reached the center, Grace Whitfield was already there, standing over a technician's shoulder with an expression I had never seen on her before. It was not anger. It was something closer to disbelief, the look of someone watching a fact rearrange itself in front of her eyes. "Talk to me," I said. "The Council issued a quarantine order against Aldrin Reach 4 hours ago," Grace said, her voice flat and careful, the way people speak when they are holding themselves together by sheer will. "Officially, the order was issued because of a reported contamination risk. Unofficially, the order was issued because Aldrin Reach sits directly on top of a mineral deposit the Threll Compact wants access to, and 3 days ago our colony engineers filed a formal claim on it. That cannot be the reason they sent an enforcement vessel," I said. "A quarantine order does not require a warship." "No," Grace said, "it does not." The technician in front of her pulled up a feed, grainy and delayed by the distance the signal had to travel, but clear enough that I could see exactly what had happened. The Threll Watcher, a Council enforcement vessel 3 times the size of anything our colony defense network could field, had arrived in the Aldrin system and broadcast a quarantine notice with a compliance window of only 6 minutes. 6 minutes for an entire colony to somehow prove a negative, to demonstrate that a contamination risk which likely never existed in the first place did not exist. When the 6 minutes ended, the Threll Watcher had opened fire on the colony's primary water reclamation plant. I felt the floor tilt under me. The water reclamation plant. The second one. The one Lily had told me about with such pride only weeks earlier. The one that had let the colony grow past 3,000 people. I grabbed the edge of the console to steady myself, and Grace put a hand on my shoulder. Not to comfort me, I realized later, but because she could see I was about to fall. "Survivors?" I asked. My voice did not sound like my own. "Unknown," Grace said. "Communications across the colony are down. The Threll Watcher has established a perimeter and is preventing any vessel from approaching, citing contamination risk. They destroyed the water plant and then used the resulting damage as proof of the very contamination they invented in the first place," I said. And even as I said it, I understood exactly what had happened. The entire shape of it laid out clear and terrible in my mind. This was never about contamination. This was never even really about minerals. This was about reminding humanity, in the clearest possible terms, exactly how little our claims meant when an older species decided otherwise. I do not remember deciding to act. I remember being at the console, pulling every raw sensor log, every uncensored communication fragment, every piece of evidence the Residency's systems had managed to capture before the Council's official channels began smoothing the story into something more palatable. I remember Grace watching me work and saying nothing, not stopping me, which told me everything I needed to know about what she believed had really happened. While I worked, a secondary screen at the technician's station began streaming the Council's first public statement on the incident, released with a speed that struck me, even in my grief, as deeply unsettling. A polished spokesperson from the Threll Compact described the strike as a precautionary containment measure, careful to use the word precautionary 3 separate times in a statement that lasted less than 2 minutes. There was no mention of the maintenance crew, There was no mention of casualties at all. There was only a vague reassurance that the situation had been resolved and that normal colonial operations would resume once a full assessment had been completed. I watched that statement twice, and somewhere in the second viewing, the last of my disbelief burned away entirely, replaced by something colder and steadier. This was not a mistake being corrected. This was a story already being written, polished, and distributed before the people who died in it had even been identified, and I understood that if I did not act quickly, the official record would harden into truth long before anyone outside this council ever heard a different version of events. It took 6 hours to compile a full package and transmit it directly to Sol Command, bypassing the usual diplomatic relay that would have let council monitors review it first. 6 hours, during which the official council news bulletin described the events at Aldrin Reach as a contained incident, a regrettable but necessary action taken to prevent the spread of an unidentified biological agent. 6 hours, during which I tried Lily's channel 40 more times and received nothing but silence. It was Grace who finally got through to someone at Aldrin Reach, a colony administrator named Owen Bell who had survived by being 3 kilometers from the reclamation plant when it was struck. His voice, when it came through the static, sounded like a man who had aged a decade in a single afternoon. "They did not warn us," Owen said. "There was no contamination. There was never any contamination. We had a routine maintenance crew at the plant, doing scheduled repairs when the order came through. 6 minutes, Grace. They gave us 6 minutes to clear an entire facility, and the maintenance crew did not even receive the notice until it was already too late." "How many?" Grace asked, and I could hear in her voice that she already knew the answer would be a number she would carry for the rest of her life. 41 confirmed, Owen said. "We are still searching the wreckage for more." I asked the question before I could stop myself. Was Lily Ashford on the maintenance crew today? The silence on the other end of the channel lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an hour. When Owen spoke again, his voice had gone very quiet. "Daniel," he said, "I am so sorry." Owen stayed on the channel a while longer, his voice cracking as he described the scene at the wreckage, the way rescue crews had worked through the night with hand tools, because the colony's heavier equipment had been stored at the very facility that no longer existed. He told us that survivors had begun gathering at the colony's central hall, refusing to disperse, demanding answers that no council representative had yet bothered to provide. He told us that a young engineer, barely out of training, had asked him directly whether Earth was going to do anything at all, or whether Aldrin Reach would simply become another quiet entry in a report nobody outside the colony would ever read. "I did not know what to tell her," Owen admitted. "I have spent 15 years believing that if we just worked hard enough, built enough, proved ourselves capable enough, this council would eventually treat us as equals. I do not believe that anymore, Grace. I do not think I believed it the moment that plant came apart." Grace promised him that Sol Command would not let this disappear quietly, and I remember thinking, even through my grief, that I had never heard her make a promise she was not certain she could keep. When the channel finally closed, the silence in the communication center felt heavier than before, as if the room itself understood that something fundamental had shifted in the conversation, something that would not be undone by a quiet offer of compensation or a carefully worded statement of regret. I do not remember leaving the communication center. I remember standing on the observation deck of the residency tower sometime later, the alien capital glittering below me, exactly as it had the night before, indifferent and beautiful, and utterly unchanged by the fact that my sister was gone, that 40 other people were gone, that an entire colony had been struck down over a mineral deposit, and a lie about contamination that had been invented to justify it after the fact. I thought about Magistrate Oduin's calm, patient voice. "We act now, not out of cruelty, but out of care." I thought about Directive 11, passed only weeks earlier, stripping humanity of the right to build the very ships that might have been able to stand between a colony full of families and an enforcement vessel 3 times their size. I understood, standing there in the cold capital air, that these were not 2 separate events. They were the same event, the same pattern, the same slow grinding machinery that had been working against my species for years, finally showing its true shape. Grace found me an hour later. She did not say anything comforting, because there was nothing comforting to say, and I think she respected me too much to try. "The council is already moving to bury this," she said instead. "Their official report will state that the contamination was real, that the maintenance crew was caught in an unavoidable containment measure, and that the Threll Compact acted within the bounds of established protocol. There will be no formal investigation. There will be no apology. There will, at most, be a quiet offer of compensation that our government will be pressured to accept in the name of maintaining stability. And if we do not accept it, I said, then we will be the ones accused of destabilizing galactic relations, Grace said. That is how this works, Daniel. It has always worked this way. They write the story, and we are expected to live inside it. I felt something shift inside me then, something that had been bending under pressure for 6 years, finally reaching the point past which it could not bend any further. I thought about every denied permit, every redrawn border, every patient explanation of why humanity was not yet ready, and I understood, with a clarity that frightened me, that none of it had ever been about readiness at all. It had been about keeping us small, keeping us grateful, keeping us exactly weak enough that incidents like Aldrin Reach could happen and be folded quietly into the official record without consequence. What did Sol Command say? I asked, when they received the package I sent. Grace was quiet for a long moment. When she finally answered, there was something in her voice I had not heard from her before. Not anger, not grief, but a kind of grim, settling resolve, as if a question she had been carrying for years had finally been answered. They said thank you, Grace said, and then they told me to stand by for further instructions. That is all? That is all, Grace said. But Daniel, I have worked with Sol Command for 20 years. I know what it sounds like when they are quietly building toward something. That was not the voice of a government preparing to send a strongly worded letter of protest. That was the voice of a government that has finally run out of patience. I did not understand, in that moment, exactly what she meant. I was too raw, too hollowed out by grief, to think clearly about strategy or politics, or what Sol Command might or might not be planning, in the silence that followed our transmission. All I could think about was Lily's voice on our last call, bright and tired and full of pride, about a water reclamation plant that would, only weeks later, become the place where she died. I stayed on that observation deck until the capital's artificial dawn began to lighten the sky, watching the lights of 100 alien districts that had no idea, and would not have cared even if they did, that somewhere across the galaxy, a colony engineer named Lily Ashford had been buried under rubble because an ancient council had decided her people's claims meant less than someone else's convenience. I did not know, as I stood there grieving in the cold morning light, that humanity's response was already in motion. I did not know that somewhere far beyond the edge of council space, in a shipyard hidden behind a decade of careful misdirection, the final systems were being brought online aboard a vessel that no alien sensor array had ever detected, a vessel built specifically for a day that Sol Command had always known, deep down, was coming. I only knew that something in me had broken at Aldrin Reach, and that I was done pretending the Council's patient cruelty was anything other than what it had always been. I went back inside, sat down at my console, and began drafting my resignation from the liaison post. I did not finish it that day, but I started it, and starting it felt, for the first time in 6 years, like taking back something that had quietly been taken from me long before. 3 weeks after Aldrin Reach, the sensors at the edge of Council space detected something that should not have existed. I was not in the residency tower when the first reports came in. I had taken a leave of absence after Lily's funeral, a quiet ceremony held over a relay channel since her body, like so many others, had never been fully recovered from the wreckage of the reclamation plant. I was sitting in a small apartment on the human residential ring, staring at a wall I had not bothered to decorate, when Grace Whitfield called me with a voice tight enough to cut glass. "Turn on the open frequency," she said. "Right now." I did, and the first thing I heard was chaos. Not the practiced, measured chaos of council bureaucracy arguing over procedure, but real, unfiltered alarm. A dozen alien voices talking over one another, on a channel meant for emergency coordination between security fleets. I caught fragments. Unidentified contact. Energy signature does not match any registered design. Request immediate confirmation of hostile intent. "What is happening?" I asked. "A ship arrived at the edge of the Threll Compact's border sector 4 hours ago," Grace said. "It did not announce itself through any recognized protocol. It did not respond to hails. It simply appeared, and every long-range sensor array in 3 systems is reporting readings that do not match anything in the Council's database." "Whose ship is it?" There was a pause on the line, and I could hear, even through the static, the careful way Grace chose her next words. Sol Command has not confirmed or denied involvement. But Daniel, I need you to understand something. I have spent 20 years reading sensor reports from every species in this council, and I have never seen numbers like the ones coming off this contact. The Threll Compact sent 2 patrol cruisers to investigate. Both cruisers attempted standard scanning protocols. Both came back with nothing. The ship is not hiding from them. It is simply too dense, too layered, too far beyond their instruments to read properly. I felt something cold and electric move through my chest, a feeling I did not yet have a name for. I left the apartment without bothering to change out of the clothes I had worn for 2 days, and by the time I reached the residency tower, the entire human delegation had gathered in the main briefing hall. Every face turned toward the central display, where a live feed from a council monitoring station showed a single point of light hanging motionless at the edge of charted space. It did not look impressive on the display. It was just a dot, a shape too distant to resolve into anything meaningful. But the data scrolling beside it told a different story. Line after line of failed scan attempts, energy readings that fluctuated in ways no analyst in the room could explain, a hull profile that the system simply labeled unknown, unable to even guess at the vessel's dimensions with any confidence. The council is convening an emergency session, Grace told the room. They want every species delegation present within the hour. Daniel, you are with me. I almost laughed at the idea that I, a junior liaison officer on leave after his sister's death, would have any meaningful role to play in whatever was about to happen in that chamber. But Grace's expression told me this was not a request, and something in the set of her jaw told me she already suspected exactly what we were about to walk into. The great assembly hall had never been this crowded in the 6 years I had served there. Every seat was filled, every delegation present, and the air itself seemed to carry a tension I had never felt in that chamber before. Not even during the vote on Directive 11. Magistrate Odwin sat in his customary place at the center of the dais, but for the first time since I had known him, he did not look calm. He looked like a man trying very hard to appear calm, which was an entirely different thing. Let the record show, Odwin began, that an unidentified vessel has entered council, monitored space without authorization, without identification, and without response to repeated hails. This council must determine, as a matter of urgent priority, the origin and intent of this contact. A delegate from the Karathi Assembly stood, her chitinous plates clicking with agitation. Our scans indicate the vessel's hull composition is unlike anything in our records. Some readings suggest material density beyond what our instruments are calibrated to measure. This is either a malfunction in our sensors, or it is something we have never encountered before. Beside her, a representative of the Othel Concord rose as well, his voice tight with an emotion I had rarely heard from his species, something close to genuine fear, rather than the practiced diplomatic concern I had grown used to in that chamber. We attempted a passive deep scan 3 hours ago, he said. The vessel did not block it did not jam it simply absorbed it, and our instruments registered nothing useful in return, as though the ship had decided our curiosity was not worth a response. I have served on sensor analysis boards for 40 years, and I have never seen a hull behave this way. It is not a malfunction, said a voice from the human section of the gallery, and I turned to see that it was Grace who had spoken, standing without having been called upon, a clear breach of council protocol that sent a ripple of disapproving murmurs through the chamber. Attash Whitfield, O'Duan said, his translator giving the words a careful, measured weight. You will wait to be recognized. With respect, Magistrate, Grace said, I do not believe you have the luxury of waiting for protocol right now. The chamber went very quiet. I watched O'Duan's expression shift, just slightly, the first crack I had ever seen in his patient, ancient composure. Explain yourself, he said. 3 weeks ago, Grace said, this council passed Directive 11, restricting humanity's right to build warships beyond a certain size, citing concerns about our readiness for the responsibilities of greater power. 1 week later, a council enforcement vessel destroyed a civilian water reclamation facility at Aldrin Reach, killing 41 of our people, under the pretense of a contamination risk that this council has not bothered to investigate. I would like to suggest, Magistrate, that the vessel currently sitting at the edge of your monitored space did not appear by coincidence. The murmurs in the chamber rose into something closer to open alarm. I saw delegates leaning toward one another, exchanging rapid, hushed words in a dozen different languages, and I understood, watching their faces, that for the first time in living memory, The council was looking at a problem it could not simply explain away with patient condescension. "Are you suggesting," Oduin said slowly, "that this vessel belongs to humanity?" "I am suggesting," Grace said, "that you should ask it yourself, rather than continuing to ask us." As if summoned by her words, the central display flickered, and a new alert scrolled across every screen in the chamber simultaneously. The unidentified vessel had moved, not toward any system, not in any aggressive maneuver that the assembled fleets could classify as an attack, but simply closer, gliding through the boundary of council-monitored space, as easily as if the boundary itself did not exist. I watched the readings update in real time, watched a dozen alien analysts across the chamber try and fail to make sense of a ship that should not have been able to move the way it was moving, that should not have been able to ignore the layered defense grids the Council had spent centuries constructing along that border. Every failed scan, every blank readout, every helpless shrug from the Korathi sensor officer added another layer of silence to the chamber, until the only sound was the quiet, steady hum of the display itself. Then the vessel stopped, hanging motionless once again, this time well within range of the capital station's own defense network, close enough that I could finally see, on the highest resolution feed the Council could produce, a shape begin to resolve out of the darkness. It was not large in the way Council warships were large, not a sprawling, layered fortress bristling with visible weapon emplacements. It was sleek, almost simple in its design, a clean, dark shape that seemed to absorb the light around it, rather than reflect it. And the longer I looked at it, the more I understood why every scan attempt had failed. There was nothing crude about this ship. Every line of it suggested a level of restraint, of deliberate, controlled power, that made the chaotic, layered designs of the Council fleets look almost desperate by comparison. "Magistrate," said the Korathi sensor officer, her voice trembling slightly. "We have a transmission request." Origin confirmed as the unidentified vessel. I thought of the last time I had heard Owen Bell's voice, broken and exhausted, telling me my sister was gone. I had not imagined, in the weeks since, that the next time I heard him speak, it would be from the bridge of a ship capable of silencing an entire council, without firing a single weapon. I wondered what had happened to him in those 3 weeks. What conversation with Sol Command had taken a grieving colony administrator and placed him at the helm of something this vast, this carefully hidden, this deliberately timed. I wondered whether he had volunteered, or whether Sol Command had simply understood that no one else carried the same weight of personal loss, the same right to be the voice that finally answered the Council on humanity's behalf. The chamber held its breath. I felt my own heart pounding so loudly, I was certain the delegates beside me could hear it. "Accept it," Oduin said. The display shifted, and for a moment there was nothing, only the soft static of an open channel waiting to be filled. Then a voice came through, calm, measured, and unmistakably human, a voice that did not shout, did not threaten, did not raise itself even slightly above the tone of someone making a simple, factual statement. "This is Captain Owen Bell," the voice said, "commanding officer of the Resolute, representing the unified government of Earth and her colonies. I am here on behalf of every human family that has lost someone to this Council's patient cruelty. I would like to speak with whoever is currently in charge." I felt my breath catch in my throat. Owen Bell, the same Owen Bell who had survived the strike at Aldrin Reach, who had told me, in a voice broken with grief, that my sister was gone. I had not known, sitting in that residential apartment 3 weeks earlier, that he had been recalled from the colony, that he had been given command of a ship I did not yet fully understand, that the man who had delivered the worst news of my life was about to deliver something far larger to an entire galaxy. Magistrate Oduin rose slowly from his seat, and for the first time in 6 years, I saw something in his ancient eyes that I had never expected to see directed at my species. I saw caution. I saw, beneath the practiced calm, the first real flicker of fear. "This is Magistrate Oduin," he said, speaking on behalf of the Galactic Council. "We welcome contact, Captain Bell, but I must ask you to clarify the nature of your vessel and your intentions before we can proceed further." There was a pause on the channel, brief but heavy, the kind of pause that felt deliberate, the kind of pause that told me Owen Bell had chosen exactly how long to let the silence stretch before he answered. "My intentions," he said finally, "are very simple, Magistrate. I am here to explain why humanity's patience has finally run out, and what we intend to do about it." The chamber erupted into a dozen overlapping conversations, alien voices rising in alarm, in disbelief, in the kind of frightened confusion that comes from watching a carefully ordered world begin to shift beneath your feet. I sat very still in the gallery, watching the dark, quiet shape of the Resolute hanging on the display, and I understood, with a certainty that settled deep into my bones, that everything I had known about my place in this galaxy was about to change. Grace leaned toward me, her voice barely above a whisper beneath the rising noise of the chamber. "Now you understand," she said, what Sol Command was building toward. I did not answer her. I could not look away from the screen, from the calm, steady shape of a ship that had appeared out of nowhere and silenced an entire council without firing a single shot, simply by existing, simply by proving that everything the council believed about humanity's limitations had been wrong from the very beginning. For 6 years I had watched my species ask permission for things that should have been ours by right. For 6 years I had translated patient refusals into careful diplomatic language, had smoothed over insult after insult in the name of stability, had told myself that this was simply how a young species earned its place among the stars. I understood now that I had been wrong. We had not been earning anything. We had been waiting, quietly and deliberately, for the moment when waiting no longer served any purpose. That moment, I realized, watching Magistrate Oduin's composure crack further with every passing second, had finally arrived. Magistrate Oduin asked Captain Bell to dock the Resolute at the capital station's primary platform, and within the hour, the Great Assembly Hall had been reconfigured to receive a single human delegation. I had never seen the chamber arranged this way before. The tiered alien seating remained, but at the center of the floor, where petitioners and lesser delegations usually stood to be addressed from above, a raised platform had been built instead, elevated almost to the level of the council dais itself. I understood immediately why. The council was not treating this as a hearing. They were treating it as a negotiation between equals, and the speed with which they had abandoned 6 years of careful hierarchy told me more about their fear than any censor reading had. Grace and I were given seats near the front of the human gallery, close enough that I could see every detail when Captain Owen Bell walked through the chamber's main doors. He did not look like a man who had spent 3 weeks grieving alongside a shattered colony. He walked with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who had made peace with whatever was about to happen, his uniform simple and dark, unadorned by the layered ceremonial markings the alien delegates wore. Behind him walked 2 officers I did not recognize, and behind them, a third figure who made my breath catch in my throat. It was Admiral Henry Voss, the Supreme Commander of Sol Command, a man I had only ever seen in official briefing recordings, never in person, never standing in a chamber that had spent 6 years deciding what my species was and was not allowed to become. The 3 of them climbed the steps to the raised platform without hesitation, without the careful, deferential pause that every other species delegation observed when approaching the council dais. Magistrate Oduin watched them ascend with an expression I had never seen him wear before, somewhere between curiosity and quiet alarm. "Captain Bell," Oduin said, "Admiral Voss, the council thanks you for your willingness to engage in dialogue. We would like to begin by addressing the unfortunate incident at Aldrin Reach, which we understand has caused significant distress within your delegation." "Unfortunate incident," Admiral Voss repeated, and his voice, though quiet, carried through the chamber with a clarity that made every alien delegate go still. "Magistrate, 41 of our people are dead because a council enforcement vessel fabricated a contamination order to clear the way for a mineral claim dispute. I would ask you not to insult their memory by calling it unfortunate, as though it were a weather event, rather than a decision made by people sitting in chairs, not unlike the ones you occupy now." A ripple of uneasy murmurs moved through the gallery. I glanced at Grace, whose expression had not changed, but whose hands, folded carefully in her lap, had gone white at the knuckles. "We understand your grief," Oduin said carefully. "The council is prepared to offer a formal statement of regret, along with appropriate compensation to the affected families, in line with established protocol for incidents of this nature." "Established protocol," Voss said. "Magistrate, I have read your established protocol. I have read it for the strike at Aldrin Reach, and I went back further and read it for 11 other incidents over the past 40 years. Incidents involving other young species who are no longer represented in this chamber because their populations were reduced past the point of meaningful recovery, before anyone outside this council ever learned their names. Your established protocol is not a system of accountability. It is a system of containment, designed to absorb the consequences of decisions made by older species at the expense of younger ones, and to ensure that those consequences never accumulate into anything resembling resistance. The chamber had gone completely silent now. I realized I was holding my breath. "That is a serious accusation," Oduin said, and for the first time, his ancient composure wavered visibly, his voice losing some of its practiced smoothness. "It is not an accusation," Voss said. "It is a pattern, magistrate, and patterns do not require accusation. They require only observation, which is something humanity has been doing very carefully for a great many years, even while this council assumed we were simply too young to notice what was happening around us." Captain Bell stepped forward then, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different quality than the Admiral's, quieter, but somehow heavier, weighted with something personal that I recognized immediately, because I had heard it in his voice once before, on the day he told me my sister was gone. "I was at Aldrin Reach," he said. "I watched the reclamation plant burn. I watched a maintenance crew of 41 people die because they were given 6 minutes to evacuate a facility. This council had no genuine reason to quarantine. I personally informed the families of the dead, one by one, over the course of 3 days, because there was no one else to do it. I am not standing on this platform today because Sol Command ordered me to. I am standing here because I made a promise to those families that I would make certain their deaths meant something more than a line item in a compensation report." I felt something tighten in my chest. A grief I had carried quietly for 3 weeks, suddenly given voice by a man standing in front of the entire galaxy's governing body. I glanced at the Karathi delegation, at the Threll Compact representatives whose mining claim had started this entire chain of events, and I saw, for the first time, something other than careful diplomatic neutrality on their faces. I saw discomfort. I saw, in a few cases, something that might almost have been shame. "What is it you want?" Oduin said finally, and the question, stripped of its usual ceremonial weight, sounded almost desperate. Admiral Voss did not answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, the same deliberate silence Captain Bell had used hours earlier when first hailing the chamber, and I understood now that this was not hesitation. It was control, a demonstration, in its own quiet way, of exactly how much patience humanity still had left to spend, even now, even after everything. "We are not here to make demands within your existing framework," Voss said at last. "We are here to inform you that humanity is withdrawing from council oversight entirely. We will no longer submit our colonial charters for approval. We will no longer accept restrictions on the scale of our defense capabilities. We will no longer wait for permission to protect our own people from enforcement actions justified by manufactured threats." The chamber erupted. I heard a dozen overlapping voices, alien delegates rising from their seats, demanding clarification, demanding explanation, demanding that this council reassert some version of the order that had just been calmly, deliberately dismantled in front of them. Magistrate Oduin raised a hand, and slowly, reluctantly, the chamber quieted. "You cannot simply withdraw from this council," Oduin said. "The treaties signed by your government bind you to." "The treaties signed by our government," Voss interrupted, "were signed under the explicit understanding that this council would act as a fair and impartial body, protecting younger species during a period of vulnerability, while we grew into our place among the stars. That understanding has been violated, repeatedly, over the course of 6 years, culminating in the deaths of 41 of our citizens. A treaty built on a broken promise no longer carries any binding weight, and I suspect, Magistrate, that you already know this, which is precisely why your council has spent the last several hours scrambling to determine the origin of a single ship, rather than calmly reasserting the authority you claim still applies to us." I watched Oduin's face, and I saw, in that moment, the full collapse of 6 years of carefully maintained condescension. He was not looking at a desperate young species pleading for a seat at the table. He was looking at a species that had quietly, patiently, built the capability to walk away entirely, and had simply chosen, until this exact moment, not to. "The Resolute," Oduin said slowly, his eyes moving to the dark, motionless shape still visible on the chamber's primary display, "is a single vessel. Impressive, certainly, beyond anything our scans can adequately analyze, but a single vessel cannot stand against the combined fleets of this council, should this body choose to view your withdrawal as an act of aggression." Captain Bell smiled then, and it was not a cruel smile. Not a threatening one, but something far more unsettling in its quiet certainty. "Magistrate," he said, "the Resolute is not a threat. The Resolute is a demonstration, sent specifically to show you what a single vessel built under the restrictions of Directive 11 could become, if we had simply chosen to comply with your limitations, rather than quietly developing beyond them, in anticipation of exactly this kind of moment. I would ask you to consider, carefully, what an entire fleet of vessels built without those restrictions might look like, and whether this council genuinely wishes to find out." The silence that followed was the longest I had experienced in 6 years of attending sessions in that chamber. I watched delegate after delegate exchange glances, watched the careful diplomatic mask slip from face after face, as the full weight of what had just been said settled over the room. This was not a young species making an empty threat. This was a species that had spent decades quietly preparing for a betrayal it had always suspected was coming, and had finally, after the deaths of innocent people, decided it no longer needed to pretend otherwise. A representative from the Threll Compact, the same delegation whose mineral claim had started the entire chain of events, rose from the gallery, her voice carrying the careful, defensive tone of someone who knew she had already lost the argument before speaking. "The Compact maintains that our enforcement vessel acted within the bounds of a legitimate quarantine order," she said. "We dispute the characterization of our actions as deliberate fabrication." Captain Bell turned to face her directly, and though his voice remained calm, there was an edge to it now that had not been present before. "Then perhaps you can explain," he said, "why the contamination alert was filed only after your mining survey team had already begun preparing equipment near the reclamation plant, 4 days before the quarantine order was issued. Sol Command has the full timestamp record, Ambassador. We would be glad to enter it into this council's official log, if you believe transparency will support your position." The Threll representative did not answer. She sat back down slowly, and the silence that followed told everyone in the chamber everything they needed to know. "What do you propose?" Oduin asked, and his voice, for the first time since I had known him, sounded genuinely uncertain. "We propose nothing," Admiral Voss said. "We are not here to negotiate the terms of our continued participation in your council. We are here to inform you, as a courtesy that this council has rarely extended to us, that humanity will be establishing its own sphere of governance, separate from your oversight, and that any future enforcement action taken against our colonies will be treated as exactly what it is, an act of aggression against a sovereign people, and will be answered accordingly." I watched Grace beside me, her hands finally relaxing from their tight, white-knuckled grip, a quiet, grim satisfaction settling over her face that I had never seen from her before. I understood, watching her, that she had spent 20 years waiting for this exact moment, carrying the same patient anger I had only discovered in myself over the past 3 weeks. A delegate from the Vance Collective rose hesitantly from the gallery, an elder whose species I knew, from old briefing documents, had lost a colony decades earlier, under circumstances the council had also labeled an unfortunate incident. "Admiral Voss," the delegate said, her voice trembling with something that sounded almost like hope, "if humanity is prepared to challenge this council's conduct so directly, would you be willing to support a formal review of similar incidents involving other species? We have waited a very long time for someone with the standing to ask the questions we were never permitted to ask ourselves." Admiral Voss turned to her, and his expression softened slightly, the first crack in his otherwise unshakable composure. "We did not come here today to fight only our own battle," he said. "If this council's pattern of conduct extends beyond humanity, and I suspect it does, then any species willing to bring forward honest evidence will find an ally in us. We have spent 6 years being told we did not yet understand how this galaxy worked. I think, in truth, this council simply did not expect any of its younger members to keep such careful records." The Vance delegate sat back down slowly, and I watched something pass through the gallery, a quiet ripple of recognition among species who had perhaps never spoken openly to one another about their own quiet grievances, their own carefully buried incidents. It struck me, watching it happen, that humanity's defiance had done something the council could never have anticipated. It had given every other patient, frightened species in that chamber, permission to finally stop pretending their own histories were as clean as the official record claimed. Magistrate Oduin rose slowly from his seat, and for a long moment, he simply looked at the 3 figures standing on the platform before him, at the calm, unshakable resolve in their faces, the absence of any fear, any desperation, any of the careful deference this chamber had grown accustomed to receiving from younger species. "This council will need time to deliberate," he said finally. "Take all the time you need, Magistrate," Admiral Voss said. "We have waited 6 years for this council to treat us fairly. We can certainly wait, while you decide whether to accept the new reality, or whether you would prefer to test it." The three of them turned and descended the platform together, walking back through the chamber's main doors with the same steady, unhurried pace they had entered with, leaving behind a council that had, for the first time in living memory, been left without a clear answer to give. I sat in the gallery long after the chamber began to empty, watching the dark shape of the Resolute on the display, thinking about my sister, about 40 other names I had memorized over 3 sleepless weeks, about 6 years of patient diplomatic language that had finally, mercifully, run its course. Something had shifted in that chamber, something far larger than a single vote or a single incident, and I understood, sitting there in the quiet aftermath, that the galaxy I had grown up believing in no longer existed. A new one had taken its place, and humanity, finally, had a voice in shaping it. The weeks that followed Admiral Voss's declaration moved faster than anything I had experienced in 6 years of slow, patient diplomacy. Within days, the Karathi Assembly requested a private meeting with Sol Command, not to challenge humanity's withdrawal, but to quietly ask how a species so recently considered young and dangerous had managed to outmaneuver a council that had spent centuries perfecting the art of controlling exactly that kind of growth. Grace told me later that the meeting had not gone the way the Karathi delegates expected. Admiral Voss had not gloated, had not offered humanity's methods as some kind of trade, had simply explained, calmly and without embellishment, that patience and preparation were not unique to any single species, only rarely practiced by ones who had been promised fairness, and received it. Word of the confrontation in the Great Assembly Hall spread through the Council's member worlds faster than any official channel could control. I began hearing, through Grace and through the careful, unofficial conversations that happened in the corridors outside the chamber, that other species were starting to ask uncomfortable questions of their own. The Vance Collective, a species who had quietly lost 2 colonies to enforcement actions decades earlier, requested a full review of their own historical incidents, citing the precedent humanity had established by refusing to accept the Council's version of events without challenge. A junior delegation from a species I had barely interacted with in 6 years, the Othel Concord, approached Grace directly to ask whether humanity would be willing to share information about the restrictions placed on their own technological development, restrictions they had apparently never questioned until watching ours unravel in real time. I found myself, in those first weeks, occupying a strange new role. I was no longer simply a liaison smoothing over diplomatic friction. I had become something closer to a witness, asked again and again by representatives of a dozen different species to describe exactly what had happened at Aldrin Reach, what Captain Bell and Admiral Voss had said in that chamber, what it had felt like to watch 6 years of careful condescension collapse in the span of a single afternoon. I told the story honestly, every time, including the parts that were difficult, including my sister's name, because I understood, somewhere in those exhausting weeks, that the truth of what had happened mattered more now than it ever had before. Magistrate Oduin requested a private audience with me 3 weeks after the confrontation, which surprised me more than almost anything else that had happened. I arrived at his chambers, expecting some final attempt at the same patient, condescending diplomacy I had grown so familiar with over the years. Instead, I found an old alien sitting alone, his ceremonial robes set aside, looking smaller and more uncertain than I had ever seen him in the Great Assembly Hall. "I wanted to speak with you directly," he said, rather than through official channels. "Why?" I asked, not bothering to disguise the wariness in my voice. "Because I believe I owe you something closer to honesty than this council has offered your species in a very long time," Oduin said. "I did not order the strike at Aldrin Reach. I want you to understand that. But I also did not ask the questions I should have asked when the report crossed my desk, because doing so would have meant challenging a compact delegation whose support I needed for an unrelated matter. I told myself, at the time, that this was simply how governance worked, that small compromises were the price of maintaining a stable council. I have had several weeks now to consider how many small compromises it actually took to arrive at the death of 41 people, and I find I no longer have an answer I am proud of. I did not know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to tell him that his honesty, arriving so late, and changing nothing about what had already happened, meant very little to me. But another part of me, the part that had spent 6 years trying to understand how an entire civilization could convince itself that patient cruelty was simply the responsible management of younger species, recognized something valuable in an old man finally admitting the shape of his own failure. "What happens now?" I asked instead. "To this council?" "I do not know," Oduin admitted. 3 species have requested full reviews of historical incidents. 2 more are quietly renegotiating the terms of their own technological restrictions. The Threll Compact, who instigated the events at Aldrin Reach, finds itself facing accusations from species who had previously been content to look away from similar conduct, simply because it had never been turned against them so visibly before. I suspect this council, in its current form, will not survive the next decade. "Does that frighten you?" I asked. Oduin was quiet for a long moment. "It should frighten me," he said finally. "An old structure collapsing rarely produces something gentler in its place. But I find, strangely, that what frightens me more is the realization that we built something this fragile in the first place. Something that depended entirely on younger species never fully understanding their own strength. Your people understood it, Daniel Ashford. You simply chose, for a very long time, not to use it. I do not know whether that makes humanity wiser than us, or simply more patient. Perhaps, in the end, those are the same thing." I left that meeting without forgiving him, because forgiveness was not mine to give, on behalf of 41 families who had lost someone at Aldrin Reach. But I left it understanding something I had not fully grasped before, that the Council's collapse would not be a single dramatic event, but a slow, accumulating unraveling, species by species, as each one began to recognize the same pattern of patient control that humanity had finally refused to accept. The Othel Concord, whose sensor officer had been the first to admit publicly that the Resolute's hull defied every instrument his species possessed, became the first species to formally request membership in whatever new structure humanity intended to build. Their ambassador told Grace, in a meeting I was permitted to observe, that they had spent decades quietly resentful of restrictions placed on their own deep space exploration programs, restrictions justified by the same patient, careful language the Council had used against us. They had simply never had the standing, or the courage, to challenge it alone. Watching humanity do so had given them something they had not realized they were missing, a model for what resistance to that patient cruelty could actually look like in practice. 6 months later, I stood on the observation deck of the Resolute, invited aboard by Captain Bell himself, who had requested my presence for what Sol Command was calling the formal establishment of the Sol Compact, a new governing body, built by humanity, and the handful of species who had chosen, in the wake of the Council's unraveling, to align themselves with a government that had proven it would not abandon its own people to patient bureaucratic cruelty. Grace stood beside me, no longer wearing the title of attaché, having been formally appointed as humanity's first ambassador to this new compact, a role she had earned through 20 years of quiet, careful work that had finally found its purpose. Below us, through the viewport, I could see the lights of a dozen vessels gathering in formation, ships built without the restrictions of Directive 11, vessels whose existence the old Council would have called dangerous, would have called premature, would have called evidence of a species not yet ready for the responsibilities of true power. I thought about Lily, about the bright, tired smile she had worn on our last call, about the water reclamation plant she had been so proud of, the one that had let 3,000 people build a life on a world that had once been frozen rock. I thought about Magistrate Oduin's quiet admission, about the slow, accumulating weight of small compromises that had finally broken under the strain of a single, undeniable truth. Before boarding the Resolute that day, I had spent a week back at Aldrin Reach, the first time I had returned since the strike. The reclamation plant had already been rebuilt, larger and sturdier than before, and the colony's population had climbed past 4,000, families who had chosen to stay despite everything, who had decided that rebuilding was its own kind of answer to what had been taken from them. Owen Bell had met me at the landing pad that week, and together we had walked to a small memorial built near the new plant, a quiet stretch of garden with 41 names carved into a low stone wall, Lily's name among them, simple and unadorned, exactly the way she would have wanted it. He told me the garden had been planted entirely by colonists, that no council funding had been used in its construction, because the families had wanted something that belonged only to them, untouched by the careful diplomatic language that had once tried to call their loss unfortunate. I had stood there a long time, reading my sister's name, thinking about her question from all those months earlier, the one about why the council had never explained what exactly they were afraid of. I understood the answer now, fully, in a way I had not allowed myself to understand it before. They had been afraid of exactly this, of a patient species finally deciding that patience itself could be a kind of preparation, that quiet compliance was not the same as quiet strength. Captain Bell joined us on the observation deck, his expression calm but carrying, even now, the particular weight of a man who had delivered too much grief to too many families, in too short a time to ever fully set it down. "It does not feel like a victory," I said to him, watching the assembled fleet drift slowly into formation beyond the viewport. "It is not meant to," he said. "Victories are loud. They are meant to be celebrated. What we have built here is something quieter, a promise that no colony will ever again receive 6 minutes to evacuate a facility that should never have been threatened in the first place. That is not a victory, Daniel. It is simply the bare minimum we should have had from the beginning." I understood, standing there, that he was right. The galaxy had not been won. It had simply been rebalanced, painfully, and at a cost that could never fully be repaid, and the work of building something better than the patient, grinding machinery of the old council, was only just beginning. In the months that followed, word spread across a dozen systems that had never given humanity a second thought before Aldrin Reach. Some called us a warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when an ancient council pushes a patient species too far. Others called us something closer to a promise, proof that fairness, however long delayed, could still be demanded and won. I heard both descriptions many times, in many different languages, from delegates who had once looked at me with the same careful condescension I had grown so used to enduring. I no longer corrected them when they called humanity the galaxy's nightmare. I understood, by then, exactly what they meant, and exactly why it no longer felt like an insult. We had not become a nightmare because we sought destruction. We had become one because an entire galaxy had finally been forced to reckon with a simple, uncomfortable truth, that the species they had spent decades underestimating had been capable of ending their quiet, patient cruelty at any moment, and had simply chosen, for as long as we possibly could, not to. That patience had cost us 41 lives, including my sister's. It had cost the Council nearly everything it had built, and it had taught an entire galaxy, in the space of a single confrontation, exactly what happens when patience like that finally, irrevocably, breaks. I stood on that observation deck, watching the new fleet gather beneath a sky full of unfamiliar stars, and I understood that whatever came next, however the galaxy reshaped itself in the years ahead, humanity would never again wait quietly for permission to defend what was ours. We had learned, the hardest way possible, exactly what our silence had cost us. We did not intend to pay that price again.